Nobody talks about it, but medieval peasants survived on crops that never expired. While nobles dined on meat, poor families quietly stockpiled weird foods that lasted years without rotting. Some were so strange, even rats ignored them. Why did these forgotten crops outlast entire empires? Let's uncover it. Today, I'll show you 12 foods that made death wait in the Dark Ages. Number 12, horse beans. In the soft glow of a winter hearth, peasants around 1350 slip into their root cellars and pull sacks of dried horse beans. Meant originally for livestock, they treat them like gold. Why? Because famine hits hard, and this crop survives. Horse beans carry incredible resilience. Farmers in 1396 record yields of up to 30 bushels per acre on poor land where barley fails. That gives families protein when meat evaporates. Mini question: what happens when your only meat source vanishes? For many, these beans keep hunger at bay. The long storage matters. Some sacks show up decades later in estate inventories of the 16th century England, marked simply as beanstalk, year 1452. That lasting quality signals real survival value. Therefore, households pair them with oats and saltfish, stretching every bite. A 1498 tax record in Norfolk notes that peasants could pay 2 days' labor by delivering dried horse beans rather than coins. However, social stigma attaches. Because the beans feed animals, the rootless call eating them is last resort fare. So despite their power, they sit low in status. Yet when winter drags on and stores empty, they win quietly. If you're enjoying this story, give us hype for this video right now. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like so this series reaches every explorer out there. The next twist in this story is seconds away, and trust me, you'll want to be here when it drops, and that quiet victory sets the stage for a more unusual fallback. Acorns ground into flour in oak woodlands by desperate villagers seeking salvation. Number 11, acorns. Imagine a hillside in 1425 England, covered in fallen acorns after an early frost. Villagers gather them by torchlight. They carry baskets full, dump them into water troughs overnight to remove bitterness, then grind the flesh into coarse flour. Why go to all that trouble? Because grain fails. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 empties barns. Families in oak-rich regions turn to acorns. One woodland lease from 1389 grants tenants right of mast and acorn harvest for personal bread making. That shows the nut turns serious. Acorns store perfectly. Dried and shelled, they keep for years in burrows, sometimes hidden beneath straw to escape rats. A Scottish ditch in 1502 still held intact acorn caches, used by Highlanders during summer raids. Mini question: when your fields are flooded or frozen, what holds? Villagers blend acorn flour with rye or barley to make flatbreads, often calling it forest bread, a term that carries shame but also survival. Thus, while nobles sneer, these nuts carry families through lean decades. And that survival tool marks a strange duality: shame and strength interwoven. And the story continues to an even stranger survival food: Iceland moss, dried by coastal monks for emergency stew, thickening over long-forgotten winters. Number 10, Iceland moss. In some winters, even the fish stopped biting, but the moss kept growing. Across 13th century Iceland and parts of Norway, villagers turned to lichen-covered rocks for food. They weren't foraging. They were surviving families, scraped Iceland moss off cliffs and stones, dried it by the hearth, and boiled it down to thicken stew. Not for taste, for calories. Monks in Thingeyrar Abbey in 1290 wrote that a single cloth sack of dried moss could feed 6 souls for 12 days. That's how desperate it got. Then they called it bread of the blessed. Strange name, but when grain failed, moss filled bowls. The trick? Drying it flat storing it away from moisture. Some even layered it between fish skins to keep the bugs out. In famine years, one traveler described it as the last green of the land. It didn't rot. It didn't spoil. It simply waited. However, not everyone could handle it. In parts of Denmark, children grew sick after eating too much untreated moss. So locals began mixing it with barley or old broth. Then came a crop that looked like rope, but hid something edible, oily, and strangely overlooked. Number 9, hemp seeds. Medieval farmers grew hemp to make rope, cloth, and sail canvas, but they also quietly ate the seeds. Records from 1313 in France list hempen gruel made during Lent. The seeds were crushed into a paste, then stirred into oat porridge. Why? Because it gave energy. One monk wrote that a spoonful of the seed oil strengthens a man beyond his meager frame. Hemp grows fast and resists cold. It thrives in rough soil, and its seeds dry clean. In 14th century Bavaria, a family might store 3 sacks of seeds through winter, hidden in the rafters. But why hide them? Because church leaders frowned on using them as food. Some claimed it tempts the body. Still, peasants knew the truth. A bowl of mashed hemp with turnips kept you working in frost. The oil didn't freeze. The seeds didn't mold. It worked. By 1478, hemp seed paste was banned in 2 abbeys during fasting weeks for being too rich. That says something. But what happens when a banned food becomes essential in poor villages and then sparks trade with foreign cities? Number 8, chickpeas. In 1347, a ship docked in Marseille carrying cloth, dates, and sacks of dried chickpeas. Days later, the Black Death followed it in. But those chickpeas, they stayed. Merchants kept trading them up through Italy into German towns, then east toward Krakow. These little beige seeds traveled with caravans, knights, even monks crossing the Alps. Why did they spread so fast? Because they were light, dried hard, and gave real fuel. One record from a 15th century Flemish monastery said a single cup lasts a man through toil, even without meat. When grain stores collapsed during siege or drought, these things still boiled into stew. Plus, they had status. Nobles used them during fasts. Priests cooked them with garlic and vinegar, saying they were clean to the spirit. It wasn't common in the north, but when you saw chickpeas, you knew someone had connections. Some towns even began growing small plots. An experiment, really. But storing them worked better. Sealed in jars, they lasted over 10 years in dry climates. So what about crops that didn't travel far, but got buried underground just to survive the freeze? Number 7, rutabagas. When winter hit hard in 1382, records from Uppsala say people ate almost nothing but roots, pulled from hay-lined pits. Rutabagas, or Swedes as some called them, were lifesavers. These weren't fancy garden vegetables. They were big, rough, cold-soaked turnips, bred to survive frost. And the colder it got, the sweeter they turned. Villagers buried them under straw near the hearth or in deep earth cellars. Some left them out in snow on purpose, waiting for the freeze to turn starch into sugar. It worked. A farmer in 1431 wrote that those roots grow teeth in a man's belly. They boiled them, mashed them, and fermented them with cabbage scraps. Sometimes they dried thin slices and tucked them into bread dough. And they held up through war, through famine, through 5-month winters. In parts of Norway and Scotland, they became the main meal for entire villages. No spice, no salt, just fuel. But there's one ancient seed that fed armies, grew in 70 days, and sparked fights between farmers and priests over who really owned it. Number 6, buckwheat. Buckwheat grows in under 3 months and in soil too poor for wheat or barley. That's why peasants called it the hunger crop. By the late 1200s, it spread fast across Eastern Europe. It came west with the Mongols, then crept into Germany, Poland, and finally France. By the 14th century, it wasn't noble food. It was survival. When rains rotted the wheat fields, buckwheat stood tall. People boiled it into porridge or baked it into dark, dense loaves. Some even fermented it to stretch out thin beer. It didn't feed kings. It fed cold bellies. In Brittany, France, families built ovens just for buckwheat galettes, round, hot cakes eaten with onions and lard. In Russia, it became the core of the peasant dish. Kasha monks praised it in records from 1365, calling it a blessing in damp years. It stored well in dry sacks, too. Unlike wheat, it didn't mold as fast. But what about when your food supply literally fell from the trees and you had to climb rooftops just to save it? Number 5, dry apples. In 1423, a frost wiped out most grain in Würzburg. But peasants didn't panic. They looked up. Trees had dropped hundreds of apples. They sliced them fast, laid them out on thatched rooftops, barn ledges, even on warm stones. In 2 days, the sun did its job. These windfall apples, dried and leathery, kept for months, sometimes all winter. Kids snuck them like candy. Soldiers packed them into satchels. Housewives soaked them in ale or stew to make bitter greens bearable. Some families even traded them for salt or oil. One traveler in 1451 wrote, "The poor here make winter from their trees." He meant it. In years with no barley, dried fruit kept people going. No sugar, no wax, just time and sunlight. But things got darker when the grain that once built empires started giving way to something older, tougher, and some believed holy. Number 4, Spelt. Spelt was growing in Central Europe while Rome still ruled, and peasants in the Alps never gave it up. By 500 CE, it had already outlasted droughts, wars, and plagues. It held strong where wheat failed. Hard outer husk, deep roots, and tougher stalks meant it could grow in rocky, high-altitude soil. So peasants kept planting it, even when lords called it peasant grain. It tasted nuttier, took longer to mill, but stored better. Sealed in clay jars or sacks, whole spelt grains could last for years. One record from a monastery in 1279 shows a stockpile untouched since a famine 3 winters earlier. They baked it into black bread or boiled it into porridge. In Bavaria, midwives gave it to new mothers. In Thuringia, it was used in wedding stews, and it never faded from memory. Hildegard of Bingen called it the best of grains in her healing texts from 1150. But what happens when a leafy vegetable lasts so long underground? It comes back smelling like vinegar and fire? Number 3, cabbage. Fermented cabbage kept peasants alive during brutal, frozen winters, especially north of the Rhine. People didn't just eat it fresh. They packed it with salt into barrels, sealed with lard, and left it in underground pits or stone cellars. 6 weeks later, it turned sour, but that's exactly what they wanted. Sauerkraut shows up in records from the 13th century Poland, where nobles called it vinegar leaf. Soldiers took it on long marches because it kept scurvy away. And in Bergen, dried cabbage leaves hung from attic beams, rehydrated in stews during snowstorms. Some villages buried whole heads of cabbage under hay. In 1346, when grain prices tripled after a failed harvest, cabbage fed over 60% of one Bohemian town's poor. It smells harsh, but to starving families, it tasted like survival. But what do you do with a crop that actually gets sweeter when left in freezing mud and never needed a cellar in the first place? Number 2, parsnips. Parsnips get sweeter the longer they stay buried in freezing ground. Medieval peasants figured that out long before science did. Instead of harvesting them in fall, they left them in the soil. By February, after weeks of frost, the starch inside broke down into sugar. So when everything else froze or ran out, the roots were still there, ready to dig up and eat. In 1293, English tax records mention parsnip bundles traded for firewood. And during the cold spells of the 14th century, some families packed layers of hay over the ground just to keep them hidden longer. They roasted them, mashed them with goat fat, and sometimes even used them to stretch flour. A 14th century recipe in France calls for grated white root added to barley mash during feast days when meat was banned. Parsnips became winter's fallback plan. Sweet, earthy, and impossible to kill. But what about a crop so sturdy it survived open sacks, damp barns, even rodents, and kept feeding families 10 years into a war? Number 1. Dry peas. Dry peas were survival food, boiled thick, ladled hot, and eaten daily across almost every peasant village in Europe. Once dried, they could sit in sacks for years without going bad. Some were sealed with wax, others just tied off with leather. In a 1361 English manor record, peas stored 5 years earlier were still feeding over 40 workers. They weren't glamorous, just boiled into pottage, a kind of gluey stew. But they filled their stomachs fast. Monks ate them during Lent. Soldiers carried them in canvas rolls. And in famine years, like 1315, when wheat failed, peas became the bulk of peasant calories. They needed no cellar, just a dry corner and patience. But in 1427, when a shipload of grain spoiled in Bruges, dry peas were blamed for a deadly sickness. Townsfolk rioted and burned sacks in the street. So what happens when a plant that looks harmless ends up banned in one kingdom? For reasons that still divide historians? That was just the beginning. History hides more survival tricks buried under dust and time. Click the next video on your screen right now before it disappears. Another story is waiting for you.